In this video, we're going to take a look at how to blur fast-moving objects in order to get a greater sense of realism in your 3D scenes. When fast-moving objects are photographed, you many times see a blurring effect around their edges. That effect is referred to as motion blur. When using a real-world camera, the blurring effect is in part created by the camera's shutter speed, which basically represents how long the eye on the camera stays open or closed. If an object is moving quickly during the time that the camera shutter is open, that object will naturally appear blurred on the film image. 3ds Max offers a couple of different ways to produce that blurring effect. Let's start with a file named Motion Blur Teapot. You can find it in the Working Files folder. If we scrub the timeline, we'll notice that the teapot quickly slides on its skis from one side of the screen to the other. Let's move to around frame 13 and we'll render. The blurring effect that we're wanting on our racing across the screen teapot doesn't happen by default. It has to be set up. Here's how you can do that. Closing the render, we'll go back and select the teapot in the viewport. Once we've done that, we'll right-click and head down to the lower right-hand square in the menu. From there, we'll choose Object Properties. Down at the bottom of the dialog on the right-hand side, you'll see a category called Motion Blur. In there, we'll activate Image Motion Blur. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and close the dialog and render again. This time to render, I'll use the F9 shortcut. This is a file named Motion Blur Explosion. You can find it in the Working Files folder. Let's now grab the time slider, slowly scrubbing it left to right. After going back and forth a few times, let's go ahead and rest our slider on frame 35. Okay, let's go ahead and render the scene now using the Shift-Q shortcut. Although the fragments are exploding at a rather quick speed, we don't see any blur on the objects. Now, with the fragments blowing out at the speed they are, you'd think things would look a little bit better if we could add a little blur into the mix. Let's do this. We'll close the render, then select any of the fragment chunks in the scene. We can then right-click, heading back down to Object Properties. Once again in the Motion Blur category, we'll activate Image Motion Blur. We'll close the dialog and render again. Again, you'll notice the smearing effect of the blur is being applied after the render has been processed. Let's see if we can't blur things out just a little bit more. Back in the Object Properties, we'll change the multiplier to 3. After closing the dialog, we'll render again. That, I think, looks a little more realistic. Here's the way things would turn out once the animation was rendered. The movie's called Blur Explosion and can be found in the Working Files folder for this chapter. I'm going to go ahead and save this up as Motion Blur Explosion Completed if you'd like to go in for a look. Now, it's been the image version of Motion Blur that we've been using so far. Let's check out a different type. The file I have on the screen is named Motion Blur Wheel and can be found in the Working Files folder. Playing back the timeline, you'll notice that the wheel has already been animated. Let's now move to around frame 50 and we'll render. This time around, the blurring effect we'll use will be applied to the camera. So we'll close the render, then up in the upper left-hand corner at the name Camera, we'll go ahead and click. When the menu opens, we'll drop about 3/4 the way down, choosing Select Camera. This makes for a fast and easy way to select our camera without having to access it directly inside our viewport. Let's now go to the Modify column, and we'll drop down to the Multi-Pass Effect category. We'll activate Enable, then drop into the list, changing to Motion Blur. Once we've done that, we'll render again. Like when using Camera Depth of Field, Max creates a series of mini renders that are then blended together to create the smearing effect. We can adjust the number of actual render passes in the Motion Blur parameters under Sampling. Let's take the total pass count to 5. And once we've locked that in, we'll render again. This time, I'll simply leave my rendered frame window open, make the change in value, then click on the Render button in the upper right-hand corner of that window. So it works pretty good as long as the number of passes is set correctly. But one important thing to know, camera motion blur is designed to affect the entire scene, which may not always work all depending on what you have on the screen. So let's try a different option, this time using something called Object Motion Blur. Now before setting that up, we're going to want to make sure that we turn off our camera blur. So I'll close the render, then uncheck Enable over in the right-hand column. Let's go ahead and render again real quick just to verify that camera blur is no longer affecting our scene. Okay, back in the viewport, using my Control key, I'm going to select every other blade. I'll then right-click, heading back down to Object Properties. This time in the Motion Blur category, I'll use Object Blur. Now, Object Motion Blur is best used for fast-moving objects when your camera remains still. In other words, probably not the best blur to use when you've animated your camera. Let's close the dialog and render up. Object blur works by making multiple copies of the rendered object using the surrounding frames from which to pull the other needed images to create the blur effect. The higher the number of surrounding frames used to calculate the blurrier the object becomes. Now with object blur, controlling that number of frames is done through the controls in the Render Setup dialog. Directly in the rendered frame window, we can easily access that at the top of the box. You'd simply click on Render Setup. Let's use a different way though. We'll close the render so I can show you a few other options. We could also choose to use the Render Setup on the right-hand side of the toolbar. Or if wanted to use a keyboard shortcut, we'd simply type F10. Any way you want to go, let's go ahead and open up the dialog. Okay, up at the top you'll see a series of tabs. Go ahead and click on the one named Renderer. We'll then drop down to the section named Object Motion Blur. The duration frame setting is your frame number control. So right now we're using 1/2 of one frame in each direction to control the blur. Let's change that duration number to 1, then we'll hit the render button in the lower right-hand corner of the dialog. Now that gives us more of a pronounced blurring effect. Let's see how things would look if we change the duration to 2. With that, we've probably got just a little too much. Let's return to duration, this time setting it to 0.7. Now that looks pretty good. This determines the actual number of calculations being made in order to control the quality of the blurring effect. Let's see how things would look if we took that number up just a tad. How about 15? We'll type in our value, then render again. That yields a noticeably cleaner effect. Okay, let's go ahead and make sure that we're blurring all 8 blades, and we'll render this out one last time. I'll close all the option boxes, then select the other 4 blades. I'll then right-click, get to my object properties, and activate the Object Motion Blur. With all the blades now set to blur, let's go ahead and render again. Here's what the animation would look like once rendered out. The movie's called Blur Wheel and can be found in the Working Files folder for this chapter. So there's a few options you can try out next time blurring something in your scene. Now as we saw, the setup steps and results do vary, so keep each type in mind as you're needing to blur one or more objects in your scene. I'm going to save this out as Motion Blur Wheel Completed if you'd like to take a look.